At 5 in the morning, Emil Radev walked his ditch line with a flashlight and a notched willow stick, measuring water the way he had for 41 years. The stick went in beside the culvert. It came out wet to the third notch. He grunted, satisfied, and did not look up at the new pipes on the ridge. His granddaughter had asked him twice that month to let her help with the accounts. Twice he had said the books were fine. They were not fine, but a man who had kept 1,100 hens alive through 2 droughts and 1 fire did not hand anyone his ledger. Ivana found him at the feed shed, wrestling a torn sack alone. "Diado, you're going to throw your back out." "I've thrown it before." She took the other corner anyway. Together they tipped the grain into the bin, and she wiped her hands on her jeans and said, "You know the reason nobody helps you is that you never tell anybody anything." "I tell you plenty." "You tell me the weather." She nodded toward the ridge, where the factory's new discharge line ran silver and ugly along the slope. "You didn't tell me about those." "Pipes are pipes. Pipes are somebody's business, and their business is now 60 meters from your birds." Emil closed the bin lid. "I'll watch it." "That's not the same as telling somebody." He heard the sentence. He filed it somewhere behind the feed schedule and the water pump, where things went to be forgotten. The farm sat in a shallow bowl of land outside Kalanovo, 40 minutes from the district town, by a road that flooded twice a year. Emil's father had built the first laying house in 1961 out of brick and poplar rafters. Emil had added 3 more, then a packing room with a second-hand grading scale, then a concrete apron so the delivery van wouldn't sink in March. 1,100 brown hens, mostly Isa Browns, laid roughly 900 eggs on a good day. He sold them under a district registration to 2 buyers, Todor Panev, who ran a wholesale route to 4 village shops and a mid-size grocery in town, and a smaller standing order from the school kitchen in Kalanovo. Together they took nearly everything. The margin was thin. Feed had gone up 19% since spring, and Emil had a loan from the Agricultural Cooperative Bank, with 11,000 leva still owing on a barn roof he'd replaced 2 winters ago. He knew this. He had not told Ivana any of it. Ivana was 26, worked 3 days a week at a print shop in the district town, and drove out every Thursday and Sunday. She had studied 2 years of food technology before her mother got sick and she came home. She never finished. She had a laminating machine at the print shop, a good eye for labels, and a habit of reading regulations for fun, which Emil found both useful and irritating. His other regular company was Vasco Iliev, 72, retired from the water utility, who came by on Tuesdays to drink coffee and argue. Vasco had spent 30 years on municipal supply, sedimentation basins, sand filters, chlorination. He talked about backwashing the way other men talked about football. Emil had heard it 1,000 times and absorbed more than he admitted. The ditch was the farm's spine. It ran along the north edge of the property, took runoff from the ridge, and carried it under the road through a concrete culvert to the Kalina stream. Emil's hens ranged on the north paddock during daylight. Free range was the only reason Panev paid what he paid, and the paddock's low corner touched the ditch at a shallow, muddy lip where the hens drank and scratched. The laying houses sat on the flat, their board floors 20 centimeters above grade. In wet years, water came into house number 4. Emil had meant to raise it for 6 years. The factory was Aurora Ingredients, a food colorant plant that had bought the old fruit processing works up on the ridge in 2019 and expanded twice. It employed 31 people from Kalanovo, including Panev's son-in-law. In April, it had run a new discharge line down the slope to a stilling basin above the ditch. Emil had asked at the municipality and been told the permit was for treated process water and that the outfall discharged to the Kalina under a district authorization. He had taken this as an answer. He also knew, without thinking of it as knowledge, some things that would matter later. That eggshell was calcium carbonate, laid down over roughly 20 hours in the shell gland. That anything staining a shell from outside sat on the cuticle, the thin protein bloom on the surface. That washing an egg removed that bloom and shortened its shelf life, which was why he never washed, and why the district rules for his grade said not to. He knew hens preferred the highest, darkest box. He knew a hen that walks through mud, brings the mud to bed with her. He kept a shelf of things he might need someday: 2 1,000-liter plastic IBC totes from a defunct cider maker, a roll of geotextile, half a pallet of river gravel, sacks of washed sand from the barn floor job, and 4 bags of hardwood charcoal he'd made himself in a pit for a nephew's wedding roast and never used. That was the farm. 900 eggs, 2 buyers, 11,000 leva owing, 1 granddaughter he wouldn't tell, 1 retired waterman who wouldn't shut up, and a ditch he measured every morning with a willow stick. On the 14th of May, the stick came out wet to the 6th notch, and the water on it was the color of apricot juice. He stood there a long moment with the flashlight on the stick, thinking first that he'd picked up clay. He rubbed the wood with his thumb. The color didn't smear like silt. It had gone into the grain. He walked the ditch upstream. 40 meters on, where the Stilling Basin's overflow spilled through a notched weir, the water came out bright, not muddy orange, but clean orange, the way a dye comes out of a dropper. It ran down the channel and vanished under the road. The ditch was full, higher than he had ever seen it in May, and the overflow had gone over the low lip into the north paddock's corner, standing 8 or 10 centimeters deep across maybe 200 square meters of ground his hens used every day. The sun came up while he was standing in it. In daylight, the stain on the grass was unmistakable, a tide mark the color of rust and marigold running along the paddock's low edge. He let the hens out at 6 because he always let the hens out at 6, and then he stood at the fence and watched 150 of them go straight to the wet corner, because that is where the worms come up. By 8, birds were walking back toward the houses with orange to the hock, orange spattered up their breast feathers, orange on their beaks from drinking. Emil went into house 4 and lifted the lid of the first nesting box. The eggs were peach. Not all of them. 6 of the 11 in that box were normal brown. 5 were peach, blotched, 1 nearly amber across the fat end where a hen had settled her wet feet. He carried them to the packing room and set them on the grading table under the window and looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then he did what he had always done with a problem. He tested it. He filled a bowl with water and put the amber egg in. It sank and lay flat, which meant fresh. He took a clean rag and rubbed the shell. The color lifted a little, faintly onto the rag, and stopped. He rubbed harder. It stopped again. Whatever it was had gone into the cuticle and the top of the shell, and no further. He cracked it into a white saucer. The white was clear, the yolk a normal deep gold, and it smelled like an egg. That should have settled it. It did not, because Emil knew the difference between what a thing was and what people would believe it was. He called Panev at 9. "How many?" Panev said. "Today. Maybe 80 out of 900. Tomorrow more. It depends on the ditch. Emil." A pause with a lighter clicking in it. "I take 300 cartons a week through shops with people who read the newspaper. You want me to put an orange egg on a shelf in Kalinovo? It's on the outside. I cracked one. You cracked one. I'll crack 20. And I'll believe you, and my customer won't, and I'll eat the whole delivery. Panev breathed out. Hold the discolored ones. Send me the clean ones. And Emil, my son-in-law works up there. Don't make a war out of a wet spring. By 11, the count was higher. Emil walked to the municipality in the afternoon and was told, politely, by a woman who wrote his name on a form, that Aurora held a valid discharge authorization, that the parameters were monitored quarterly, and that if he believed there was a problem, he could file a complaint with the Regional Environmental Inspectorate, who would schedule a visit. She said, schedule. The way people say it about a dentist. Aurora's plant manager, a careful man named Georgy Slavov, met him at the gate rather than the office. He listened, which was worse than not listening. The Stilling Basin overflowed on the 12th, Slavov said. We've had rain. It's within tolerance. The colorants are food grade, Mr. Radev. People eat them. They eat them in a cake, not out of my ditch. I understand you're upset. I'm not upset. I'm asking you to stop the overflow. I'll look at the weir. Emil went home. That evening he did what a man does when he has been told nothing twice. He tried the easy fix. He dragged a roll of old sheep netting and 40 stakes to the paddock's low corner and fenced the hens off the wet ground. It held for one day. On the second day the ditch rose again and put water on the dry side of his fence, and the hens found it, and now the wet strip was inside their walking route to the houses. On the third day the eggs were half discolored, and the school kitchen called to say they'd pass this month. He drove to the district town and stood in a shop and looked at eggs. Then he stood in the pharmacy aisle where they sold cheap disinfectant and thought about washing every egg, and remembered that washing strips the cuticle, that his registration was for unwashed eggs, and that a washed egg out of a farm with a stained yard would rot faster and prove nothing. At home, Ivana was waiting on the packing room step with 2 of the amber eggs in her hands, turning them in the light. Panev told his cousin, who told the whole village, she said, "There's a man on the Kalanovo page saying you should destroy the flock. He can come and do it." Diado. She held one up. "How long have you known about this?" 6 days. 6 days. She set the egg down very carefully, which was worse than if she'd thrown it. "And the bank loan? How long have you known about that?" He didn't answer. "That's what I thought," she said. The next morning the stick came out wet to the 7th notch, and Emil stood in his ditch and understood 2 things at once: that fencing and complaining would lose him the farm by autumn, and that he had 800 eggs in his packing room that nobody in Kalanovo would touch, and that were, in every way that mattered, perfectly good eggs. He didn't sleep. At 4 he lit the packing room light and laid out 100 discolored eggs on the grading table in rows by shade, pale peach through to that deep marigold, and looked at them the way you look at a field before you decide what to plant. Nobody in Kalanovo wanted an orange egg because everyone in Kalanovo knew what was in the ditch. Nobody outside Kalanovo knew anything at all. They would see 100 shells, no 2 alike, in a wooden tray. That was the whole idea, and it was half wrong, because it assumed he could keep the ditch out of the conversation. At 6, he woke Ivana in the spare room. "I need 3 things," he said. "I need the hens off that water permanently, not with netting. I need to prove the inside of these eggs is clean, on paper, with a stamp, and I need somebody who isn't Panev to buy them." She sat up, hair flat on one side. "That's not 3 things, that's a business." "Then it's a business. With what money?" 11,000 owing and 400 in the tin, he said. It came out of him like a tooth. Ivana was quiet. Then she got up and went to find a notebook. Vasco came on Tuesday, as he came every Tuesday, and found Emil in the paddock with a spade. "You're digging in the wrong place," Vasco said. "I'm digging where the water is." "The water's where it is because of what's 50 meters up." Vasco crouched, put a finger in the wet ground, held it up orange, and looked at it with something Emil didn't like. Not sympathy, interest. 30 years I ran sandbeds and nobody let me try anything. Now you've got a problem and no budget and no permission from anybody. He wiped his finger on his trousers. "This is the best week I've had since I retired. It's my farm, Vasco. It's your farm. It's my ditch too. It goes to the Kalina. My grandsons swim in the Kalina." He straightened up with effort. "So, it's not a favor. Understand? I'm not doing you a favor." Emil found that he preferred this. A favor he would have refused. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee. Make it strong. You're going to need to hear about backwashing." Vasco drew on the back of a feed invoice with a carpenter's pencil, and the first thing he drew was not a filter. "Before anything," he said, "you separate. Filtering water you don't need to touch is stupid. What water do you actually need? Drinking for the birds comes off the well. That's clean. Then the ditch water is nothing to you except that your hens stand in it. They walk through it to the houses. So the problem isn't chemistry. It's geometry." Vasco tapped the invoice. "Move the geometry." They walked the paddock together, and Emil saw it the way he hadn't for 6 years. The low corner where the ditch lipped over, the natural fall of the ground toward it, the houses sitting on the flat with their pop-holes facing north, straight down the slope, so that every hen in the yard walked the wet line 4 times a day. The obvious fix was to raise the houses. Emil priced it in his head, jacking 4 buildings, new piers, 2 weeks of labor he didn't have, and money he didn't have. "Not all 4, Ivana said, on Thursday, with the notebook. "Number 4 is the one that floods. The others are fine, and you don't need to raise a building to keep a hen's feet dry. You need to raise the path." That was the observation, and it came from her, and Emil noticed himself resenting it before he accepted it. They spent 9 days building what Vasco called the causeway, and Emil called the walk. It was not clever. It was a raised route of compacted rubble and crushed brick. Emil had 2 trailer loads of demolition brick from the old fruit works, bought years ago for 400 leva and never used. Laid 70 centimeters wide from each pop-hole, running east along the contour, away from the ditch, to a new gate into the upper paddock. On top of the rubble went a layer of coarse gravel, then a skin of dry sand that the hens could dust bathe in. On both sides, for the first 30 meters, they fenced with wire and then dug a shallow interception trench on the ditch side, backfilled with more rubble, so overflow water spread and sank rather than sheeting across the yard. The upper paddock was 6/10 of a hectare of thin grass that Emil had used for hay and then stopped using because it was awkward to mow. It was 2 meters above the ditch. It had no shade, which mattered, because free-range hens will not use open ground in July. They want cover from hawks and sun. So they dragged out 11 old pallets on blocks and planted 4 rows of Jerusalem artichoke tubers from Vasco's garden, which grow fast and tall and which hens will shelter under by August. The first test was on the 17th day. Emil opened house 3 at 6 in the morning and stood back. 300 hens came out and went straight down the slope to the wet corner, because that is where the worms are, and hens do not read plans. 2 weeks, Vasco said. They're creatures of habit. So are you. They shut the lower paddock entirely for 11 days, which meant the flock had no ranging area but the bare upper field, which meant 3 days of feather pecking and a drop in lay from 900 to 640. Emil hung cabbages on strings and scattered scratch grain in the afternoons to give them work. Lay came back to 810 by the end of the second week. It never fully recovered that season. 900 had been a good year number. The cost, when Ivana added it up, 310 leva for gravel haulage, 90 for wire, 60 for gate hardware, nothing for brick or sand or pallets, and 11 days of 2 men and 1 woman working from 5 to dark, plus roughly 2,000 leva of eggs not laid. But on the 19th of June, Emil walked House 4's nest boxes at 7 in the morning and counted 9 discolored eggs out of 230. The birds were clean, which left the eggs he already had. He had, by then, 1,140 discolored eggs, held in the cool room at 12 degrees, oldest of them 34 days. "Those are gone," Ivana said. "You can't sell a 5-week egg." "I can eat a 5-week egg." "You can. A shop can't." She wrote something. "Diato, we have to accept losing the first batch. Otherwise we spend a month defending eggs instead of selling them." He didn't want to. 1,100 eggs was 230 leva at farm gate, and he had 400 leva in the tin. But she was right. And the way she was right was that she'd thought about the next batch, and he'd only been thinking about the one in front of him. They kept 200 of the most striking for photographs and testing, cooked and fed out the rest to the pigs at Vasco's brother-in-law's, and started counting from 0. Now the eggs had to be proven, and here Emil's stubbornness earned its keep, because he refused to do it cheaply. The colorants Aurora made were, per their own website, food grade, synthetic azo dyes and some natural extracts. Emil didn't know which. He didn't need to know which, exactly. He needed to know what had crossed into the egg, and that meant a laboratory. The accredited food lab in the regional center quoted him 240 leva for a basic panel on a composite sample, microbiology, and a screen for the colorant classes he named. He didn't have the names. Ivana called Aurora's office 3 times and got nothing. On the 4th call, she asked for the safety data sheets, which a supplier is obliged to make available, and after 9 days a woman emailed her 4 PDFs. Emil took the sample himself, and this is where he made his first real mistake. He sent 12 of the most vividly stained eggs, whole, because he thought the deepest color was the strongest test. The lab tested them as received, shell and contents together, homogenized, and the result came back with detectable colorant. He sat with that paper for an hour before he showed anyone. "It's the shell," Vasco said when he finally did. "You told them to grind up the shell. Of course it's in there. Nobody eats the shell." The paper says what it says. The paper answers the question you asked. Ask a better question. The second submission cost another 240 leva he took out of the tin, leaving 160. This time Ivana wrote the request herself, in the language she'd learned from 2 years of food technology and a lot of regulations read for fun, separate analysis of shell exterior, and of egg contents after the shell was cracked and discarded, on 20 eggs, with the sampling method described. While they waited, they cleaned. Not washing, Emil held the line on that. Dry brushing with a soft nylon brush removed loose surface material and, importantly, removed nothing they wanted. He timed himself. 11 seconds an egg. Ivana got it to 7. At 800 eggs a day, that was 90 minutes of somebody's hands. "We can't brush every egg forever," she said, flexing her fingers. "We won't have to. The birds are off the water. Then in 3 weeks, we won't have any orange eggs at all." They both stopped. Emil went to the door and looked out at the ridge, at the silver pipe. "No," he said slowly. "The stain isn't in the shell gland. It's on the outside. It's on the outside because a wet hen sits on an egg." "Yes? So it comes from the hen's feet and feathers." "Yes? So anything that stains a hen's feet in a nest box makes an egg like that." Ivana looked at him. "Diado, if you're about to say what I think, I'm not putting my birds back in that ditch," Emil said, and meant it, and was surprised how hard he meant it. "I'm saying the ditch did it once by accident. There's a difference between an accident and a method, and I don't know the method yet." The lab report came on the 3rd of July. Shell exterior, colorant detected, concentration reported. Egg contents, 20 eggs. After shell removal, not detected. At the method's limit of quantification. Microbiology on contents, within normal limits. Emil read it 4 times, then he read the last page aloud to Vasco, badly, stumbling on the words, and Vasco said, "Well," and drank his coffee, and Emil realized his hands weren't steady. "So we sell them," Ivana said. "So we sell them honestly," Emil said. "Every carton says where the color came from." She put her pen down. "That will halve the buyers. Then it halves them. You're doing this because it's right, or because you don't want Panev to say you hid something." He thought about that longer than she expected. "Both," he said, "but the first one's on top." The label took 11 days and 3 arguments. Ivana designed it at the print shop after hours. A plain craft paper band for a 6-egg tray. The farm's registration number. The words "unwashed," shells naturally marked, and on the reverse, in small, honest type, 4 sentences about a discharge overflow in May, a stain on the shell surface, and a laboratory report on the contents, with a line telling anyone who wanted the report to ask for it. Emil made her cut a 5th sentence that blamed Aurora by name, not out of kindness, because Ivana pointed out that a named accusation on a food label was a lawsuit with legs, and Emil, who had never been sued, discovered he was frightened of it. Then they had to find someone to buy an egg that came with a paragraph. Panev, asked again, said no, and said it kindly, which stung more. Ivana made a list of 22, bakeries, a cooking school, 4 restaurants in the district town, 2 delicatessens in the city, 3 weekend farmers markets, a hotel, a woman who ran decorated egg workshops before Easter, and a photographer who did food styling. They got 4 replies. 3 were polite refusals. The 4th was a woman named Radka Doncheva, who ran a bakery cafe in the district town and who drove out on a Saturday, walked the causeway in good shoes, looked at the ditch, looked at the lab report for a long time, and then picked up a deep amber egg and held it against the wall. "I don't want them for baking," she said. "I bake with 400 eggs a week and nobody sees a shell. I want them for the counter." "For what?" "Boiled, on a board, with salt and paprika, 3 leva." She turned the egg. "People photograph food now, Mr. Radev. That's not a joke. It's my rent." She took 30 dozen a week at 40 stotinki an egg, nearly double farm gate, on a 2-week trial, on condition that she could tell her customers the whole story, including the ditch. "That's my condition too," Emil said. "Then we won't argue." 30 dozen a week was 360 eggs against a daily lay of 800. It was not salvation. It was proof. The trouble was supply, and the trouble was that Emil had solved the wrong half of his own problem. He had spent 9 days and 460 leva making sure his hens never touched orange water again. It had worked. By the 2nd week of July, The discolored eggs had dropped to 4 or 5 a day, all from 3 old hens in House 4 who slept low and dirty, and Radka needed 50 a day. "You did it too well," Vasco said, and laughed until he coughed. Emil didn't laugh. He stood in House 4 for most of an afternoon, watching hens come into the nest boxes, and what he watched was not the eggs, it was the feet. A hen came in with wet, stained feet, turned 3 times in the box, settled and laid 2 hours later. The egg came out warm and damp, with its cuticles still soft, onto bedding that had been marked by 20 other pairs of feet. The egg wasn't stained by the ditch. The egg was stained by the in the 2 or 3 minutes when a fresh shell's cuticle was still wet enough to take it. He went to find Vasco. "I need to stain a nest box," Emil said, "without poisoning a bird." Vasco put down his cup. "Then don't use their dye." "Whose, then?" "Whatever people have been staining things with for 4,000 years. Onion skin, walnut hull, madder, beetroot, turmeric." He counted them off. "My mother did eggs with onion skin every Easter. It's brown-orange, and it's food, and it costs nothing." The obvious approach, dip the eggs, Emil rejected in one sentence. "Dipping is washing. I'd have to wet the egg, and I'd take the bloom off, and then I'm selling a washed egg under an unwashed registration and lying twice." So the stain had to reach the shell the way the ditch had, through the hen, in the box, in the first minutes. The first trial was crude. He boiled 2 kilos of onion skins from Radka's kitchen scraps in a cauldron, strained it, soaked a handful of clean straw in the liquor, wrung it out damp, and bedded 3 boxes in House 2. He got 11 eggs. 2 had a faint tea-colored smudge. 9 had nothing. "Not enough contact," Ivana said. "The ditch had a hen standing in it for hours. Straw touches the shell in 3 places." Trial 2. Chopped straw and sawdust mixed with the liquor to a dampness like squeezed tea leaves. Deeper bed. 4 boxes. Better, 7 of 14 eggs marked. Soft ochre blotches. But by the 3rd day the damp bedding had gone sour, and 1 box had visible mold, and Emil threw the lot out and scrubbed the boxes with vinegar, furious at himself, because he knew better. Damp organic bedding in July is how you get a dirty egg and a sick bird. "So it can't be wet," Vasco said. "So make it dry. A dry thing doesn't stain. A dry thing doesn't stain a dry egg. Your egg comes out wet." That was the adjustment. Emil dried the onion skin liquor down to a syrup on the wood stove, then poured it over dry, dust-fine hardwood sawdust in a tub, mixed it with a paddle, and spread it in the sun on sheets of tin until it was bone dry and the color of paprika. Sifted through a flour sieve, it made a fine, dry, faintly bitter-smelling powder that did nothing at all when he rubbed it on a cold egg. He dusted it into 4 nest boxes over clean chopped straw, 2 centimeters deep. 19 eggs. 15 marked, real marks, warm ochre and rust, mottled where the hen's body had pressed, no 2 alike. The 4 unmarked came from a box where the hens had scratched most of the powder out. The color did not rub off on a cloth after 4 hours. It rubbed off very slightly at 1 hour, which meant the eggs had to sit before handling. Emil moved collection from twice to 3 times daily, with the last collection late, and left the morning lay untouched until 10. Then the limitations arrived, one after another, the way they do. The powder was consumed. Hens scratch, dust, and carry it out on their feathers. A box needed topping up every 2nd day. 80 boxes was a lot of sawdust and a lot of onion skin, and Radka's kitchen produced maybe 3 kilos of skins a week. Emil bought culled onions from a grower at Kalanovo Market at 12 stotinki a kilo, peeled them with 2 neighbors' wives at 4 leva an hour, and cooked the skins in a 100-liter drum over a wood fire, which took a day and gave him enough powder for 11 days. Walnut Hull, tried in August, gave a deeper brown but stained his hands for a week and made 2 hens' feet look diseased, and he abandoned it. Turmeric, in trial, gave a startling gold, but at market price it cost more than the egg was worth. He used it only on 1 box, for the deepest colors, 20 eggs a week, and sold those at a lev each. By the end of August, he was sending Radka 80 dozen a week, plus 40 dozen to a delicatessen in the city, and he had paid 200 leva off the loan. Then the regional inspectorate came, 2 of them on a Tuesday in a white car in response to a complaint. They did not say whose. The senior one, Inspector Nikolova, was thorough and unhurried and had clearly read something before arriving. She walked the causeway, looked at the ditch, took photographs of the stained tide mark on the paddock grass, and took her own water sample from the weir above Emil's boundary. Then she went into the packing room and looked at 80 dozen ochre eggs in trays and said, "Explain these." Emil explained. All of it, the overflow, the first stained eggs, the 2 lab reports, the causeway, the onion skin powder, the sawdust, the sifting, the boxes, the labels. He handed her the label. She read it twice. Then she said, "You wrote this on the packaging yourself?" "Yes." Voluntarily. "Yes." Nikolova put the label in her folder. "Mr. Radev, your nest box practice needs documenting properly, and I'll want to see how you source that material. But that isn't why I'm here." She held up her sample bottle. "You're the first person who's given me a dated record of that outfall. Do you have more than 1 day?" Emil went to the shelf and took down 41 years of morning ditch readings, in pencil, in a stack of school exercise books, and set them on the grading table. The complaint, it turned out 3 days later, had come from Panev, not out of malice exactly. He'd been asked by a shop customer why the Radev farm was selling colored eggs in town when he'd told everyone they were unfit, and he had made a phone call to protect his own name. Emil found this out because Panev told him, standing in the yard, unwilling to come inside. "I said what I thought was true in May. You did. And now you've got a lab paper and I look like a fool. I'd have given you the paper in June." "In June, I'd already told the school kitchen," Panev shrugged, "and there was something old and tired in it. I'm 61, Emil. I have 1 route. You'd sell to me again tomorrow, and I'd take you, but you can't have it both ways. You can't be the farm that's suing the factory, and the farm that supplies the village." "I'm not suing anybody." "Give it a month," Panev said, and left. He was closer to right than Emil liked. Nikolova's sampling put a number on the outfall, and the number was above the authorized limit for 1 parameter on the day she sampled. Aurora received a notice, and Georgy Slavov, who had been polite in May, came down the hill in September and was polite again, in a much more expensive way. He brought a woman from Aurora's legal office named Petrova, and a proposal in a folder. "We dispute the finding," Slavov said, "but we'd rather resolve this locally. We're offering a settlement for the disruption in May and June, 4,000 leva." Emil, who owed 10,800, felt the number land in his chest. "And," Petrova turned the page, "a mutual non-disparagement clause. You'd agree not to make public statements attributing the discoloration of your product to Aurora's discharge and to remove references from your packaging. That's the 4,000. That's standard practice." Emil looked at the folder for a long moment. The honest calculation was this: 4,000 leva was more than a third of the loan. He was clearing perhaps 600 a month on the colored eggs, against feed, labor, and a repayment schedule that did not care about onion skins. He had 160 leva in the tin in July, and 300 now, and October feed was going up again. And the label had been his own idea, and Ivana had told him it would have his buyers, and it had. "I'll think," he said. He did not tell Ivana. That was the choice, and he made it the way he had made every choice for 41 years. Alone, at the grading table, at 11 at night, deciding that he would take the money if he had to, and that there was no point worrying anyone until he had to. Which meant that when Radka Doncheva phoned on the 9th of September, wanting to expand to 200 dozen a week for a new city outlet, and asked Emil directly, "Is there any chance the story on your label is going to change?" Emil said, "No." And when she asked, "Because they've been in touch with me, someone from Aurora asked what my supply arrangement was," Emil said, "That's got nothing to do with the eggs." There was a pause on the line long enough for him to hear his own answer. "Mr. Radev," Radka said, "I put a paragraph about a polluted ditch on my counter because you told me a true thing and let me repeat it. If it stops being true, I'm the one holding it. It's true." "Then say so to me when you've got the folder in your hand," she said, and hung up. He hadn't told her about the folder. She'd known there was one. October went badly in the way that farming goes badly. Not one disaster, but 4 small ones stacked. The onion supply failed first. The grower at Kalanovo Market sold his culls to a pickling operation on a whole-season contract, and Emil's 12 stotinki source became a 30 stotinki source 40 kilometers away, plus fuel. Powder cost per box more than doubled. Then the sawdust. He'd been getting it free from a joinery in the next village, and in October they switched to more MDF work, and Emil, who understood exactly why you do not put resin-bonded board dust in a nest box where a hen breathes and an egg touches, stopped taking it. He had 11 days of powder left and no substitute. Then the season. Daylight shortened, and lay dropped the way it always dropped in autumn, from 800 to 620, and the molt started early in the older birds in House 1. He'd known this was coming since August, and had planned nothing for it, because he'd been busy with the folder in the drawer. And then Ivana found the folder. She was looking for the loan statement, which she had asked for twice and not received. She read the settlement and the non-disparagement clause, and she came out into the yard with it in her hand and her face very still. "When?" "September. It's the 22nd of October. I hadn't decided." "You had decided, feel," she said. "You'd decided not to tell me. That's the same decision you make about everything. The roof, the loan, the ditch in May. 6 days, Diado. 6 days you stood in orange water and said nothing to anybody. It's my farm." "Yes." Her voice cracked and steadied. "It's your farm and your loan and your decision, and I've been driving out here 2 days a week since April, doing labels and lab submissions and calling a factory 9 times for safety sheets, and you couldn't tell me somebody offered you 4,000 leva to unsay the thing I printed. I would have told you before I signed. That's not the same as telling somebody," she said, and he heard his own words come back at him from the feed shed in May, and had nothing. She left. She did not come on Sunday. Vasco came on Tuesday and said only, "You're an idiot," and then worked 11 hours with him, replacing rotten boards in House 4, because the Jerusalem artichokes had been cut back and the causeway needed regraveling before winter, and because Vasco's grandsons still swam in the Kalina and the inspectorate file was still open, and Vasco had his own reasons. On the 3rd of November, Nikolova called to say that Aurora had appealed the finding, and that the appeal rested on the argument that a single sample on a single day proved a single day, and that without a demonstrated pattern, the notice was likely to be reduced or withdrawn. She asked, carefully, whether Emil intended to submit his ditch records formally as a supporting record. "If I do," Emil said, "does it go in my name?" "It does. And they'd see it. They'd have the right to." He thought about the folder, and the clause, and October feed, and 4,000 leva. "I need a few days," he said. "The appeal is heard on the 28th, Nikolova said. "I'd need anything by the 20th. He hung up and went out to the ditch with the willow stick and put it in, and it came out clean and wet to the second notch, because it was November and there'd been no rain and nothing was overflowing at all. Which was the problem. Nothing was overflowing. There was nothing to sample. Nikolova had one day's number, and Aurora had a lawyer, and Emil had a stack of exercise books full of a farmer's pencil marks that any lawyer would call a private diary. He read his own records that week the way he'd never read them, not for the weather, but for the pattern. 41 years, one line a day, date and notch and a word or two. Clear, silty, frog spawn, dry. From the 14th of May onward, orange, 6, orange, 7, orange, 5, faint. The pattern was there, and it was undeniable to him and worth nothing to anyone else, because a notch on a willow stick was not a measurement anybody would accept, and the color word was his eye and nobody else's. He put that in front of Vasco on the 9th of November. Vasco looked at it a long time. "You've got the wrong instrument," he said, "not the wrong idea. I've got the instrument I've got. You've got a friend who spent 30 years on a utility where nobody believed anything unless it came with a chain of custody." Vasco tapped the exercise book. "This is a log. A log is worth something if it sits next to something that can be checked by somebody else." "Like what?" "Like a bottle, with a date on it, and a signature, and a second signature from somebody who isn't you." They started that week, and it was slow, unglamorous, and mostly Vasco's discipline rather than Emil's. 200 clean glass jars from Radka's kitchen, a sampling point marked with a driven stake at the weir, another at Emil's culvert, another below the road, date, time, weather, and both their initials on a strip of masking tape. Photographs on Ivana's old phone, which Emil had to be shown 3 times how to use, each with the stake and the date card in frame, twice weekly regardless of color, because, as Vasco said, again and again, until Emil could recite it, the clean days are the evidence. Anybody can photograph a bad day, only somebody honest photographs 60 good ones. But Aurora's appeal was on the 28th, and a jar collection begun in November proved nothing about May. And on the 14th of November the powder ran out. Emil had no sawdust he trusted, no cheap onions, 620 eggs a day and falling, an order from Radka for 200 dozen a week that he had already been failing by half, and a delicatessen in the city that had begun asking why the colors were paler. He did the thing he had sworn he would not do. He went down to the ditch bed at dusk with a spade and dug 2 buckets of the orange-stained silt that had settled in the low corner in May, and carried them up to the shed. He knew, standing there with the buckets, exactly what he was doing. He knew he had a laboratory report on egg contents that said, "Not detected. For eggs stained by a hen's feet, 1 contact. In a wet nest, in a specific set of conditions." He knew that drying and grinding a concentrated silt and dusting it into 80 nest boxes was not that. He knew the difference between an accident and a method, and had said so out loud in July. He dried a bucket by the stove overnight, ground it, sieved it, and dusted 6 boxes in House 2. The eggs came out magnificent, deeper than anything he'd made with onion skin, that clean marigold, exactly the shade Radka's customers photographed. He held one up to the shed light for a long time. Then he collected all 19 of them and buried them. He did not bury the second bucket. He put it on the shelf and told himself it was for testing, and knew it wasn't. What he did instead was worse in a smaller way. He wrote to Radka and told her he could supply 120 dozen a week through the winter, not 200, and he did not tell her why, because the why was, "My color source has failed, and I have not solved it." He let her believe it was seasonal lay. She found out on the 3rd of December, when a young woman from the delicatessen drove out unannounced to photograph the farm for a display, and asked Emil cheerfully where he got the color, and Emil, tired, cornered, standing next to a shelf with a bucket of ditch silt on it, hesitated for 2 seconds too long. The young woman was not a fool. The delicatessen canceled on the 5th, not because Emil had done anything with the silt, but because he had hesitated, and because when she asked, he had said, "onion skins," in a voice that made her write it down and ask again in the car park. Radka phoned on the 6th. "They rang me," she said. "They said you were evasive about your process. I've never put that silt in an egg you sold, not one. But there's silt. There's a bucket on a shelf." A long breath. "Mr. Radev, in August I stood in front of my own customers and told them a story about a farmer who put the pollution on his own label. Do you understand what I spent?" "Yes." "I don't think you do, because you'd have called me in November when your onions ran out. I'd have found you onions. I have a bakery. I know 6 vegetable suppliers." Her voice was not angry. It was worse. "You didn't call because you don't ask people for things. I'll have the color back by January. I'm suspending the order until you show me a process I can describe out loud," Radka said. "Not because I doubt the eggs, because I can't sell a paragraph I have to check." The same week, Petrova from Aurora's legal office phoned to say the settlement offer would be withdrawn if not accepted before the appeal hearing on the 28th. Emil sat at the grading table on the night of the 8th of December with the folder open and a pen. He was 74. He had 600 hens laying, 400 molting, a loan of 10,600, no primary buyer, a suspended secondary buyer, a granddaughter who had not come out in 7 weeks, a shelf of exercise books nobody would accept, a bucket of silt he should have thrown out, and 4,000 leva on the table for the price of unsaying one true thing. He signed it. Then he sat looking at his own signature and did not put the folder in an envelope. Vasco came on Tuesday the 9th and saw the folder and the signature and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You know what happens on the 28th if you send that. They win the appeal. They win the appeal, and the outfall stays authorized at the level that put that in your paddock in May, and next spring it rains, and my grandsons swim in it." Vasco put his cup down. "I'm not going to argue with you. It's your farm and your loan. I said in June I wasn't doing you a favor. I meant it." He got up, put on his coat, and stopped at the door. "Emil, you measured that ditch every morning for 41 years and never once told anybody what it said. Not one person. Why do you think you did that?" He left before Emil could answer. On the 11th of December, at 3 in the morning, House 4 burned along its west wall. Not spectacularly. a tired extension cord under a brooder lamp Emil had rigged for the molting birds and had meant to replace since October, and a board floor he'd repaired but not rewired. The wall and roof went on that end. Emil got the doors open and drove birds out into the frost in his nightshirt and Vasco's borrowed boots, and lost 38 hens to smoke and cold, and the rest stood shocked in the yard until dawn. By morning House 4 was a third of a building. The nest boxes on the west end, 40 of them, the ones he'd built with his father's plane in 1978, were charcoal. The insurance he had was the cheap policy, fire on structures only, and it would pay something in 3 months minus excess. Ivana came at 7, having been called by Vasco, and worked all day beside him without speaking and left at dark. Emil stood in the burnt end of the house that evening with a flashlight, and the beam went across the black boards, and then across the shelf where the bucket of ditch silt sat, undamaged, with a fine gray ash across the top of it. He picked it up and carried it out and emptied it into the ditch. He didn't sleep. He sat in the packing room with the stove going and the exercise books stacked in front of him and read his own handwriting backward through 41 years. 1989. Ditch high, culvert blocked, cleared alone. 1994. Fox in House 2, lost 14, told nobody, mended wire. 2003. Roof leak, fixed. 2011, the week his wife died. Clear, 2, fed birds. Not one line in 41 years said, asked for help. Not one line said, told someone. He had thought that was strength. He had built a whole life on the idea that a man who handles it alone is a man nobody can take anything from. And what it had actually produced, this year, was 6 days of silence in May that cost him Panev. A loan Ivana learned about by accident in a drawer. A settlement she found the same way. A color source that failed in November because he wouldn't phone a woman who knew 6 vegetable suppliers, and a wire he'd known was bad since October and never mentioned to Vasco, who had spent 30 years around electricians and would have looked at it in 10 minutes. Every single loss this year had come through the same door. The eggs had never been the miracle. The eggs were just eggs. What had actually worked, the causeway, the lab report worded properly, the label, the jars with 2 sets of initials, had come from Ivana and Vasco and Radka, from him being forced to say something out loud to somebody. And the thing he was about to do on the 28th was the purest form of it. Take 4,000 leva to promise never to tell anyone what he'd seen in his own ditch. Silence, with a price on it, formalized. He thought about Vasco's question at the door. Why do you think you did that? Because if he never said it out loud, it was never really a problem. Because a man who tells people things can be told he was wrong. Around 4, he took the signed folder and fed it into the stove, page by page, and watched his own signature go. Then he did the harder thing. At 7:30, he drove into the district town and stood outside Ivana's building until she came down, and when she opened the door, he said, I burnt it, and I need to tell you about the loan, all of it, and the wire, and the onions, and the bucket, and what I did on the 8th. She stood in the doorway in a coat over her pajamas. That's going to take a while, she said. I've got until the 20th. They worked it out at her kitchen table on the 14th, with Vasco on speakerphone, and Radka called at 9 when the bakery opened. The plan had 4 parts and none of them was new. 1. Submit the exercise books to Nikolova, not as proof, but as the log, with the November and December jar samples and photographs attached as the checkable half, and a written statement of method. Vasco would co-sign as second observer, Emil's name on it publicly. 2. Rebuild House 4's West End and nest boxes properly, wired by someone qualified, paid for by the insurance, and by not having 4,000 leva. 3. Stop trying to own the color alone. Radka had 6 vegetable suppliers, a kitchen that generated onion skin daily, and a reason to want the story true. Ivana had a print shop and a food technology half-degree. Vasco had a drying yard and nothing to do on Tuesdays. 4. Write the whole process down. Onion skin, drying, sieving, dose, box, timing, and give it to anyone who asked. That's the bit you'll hate, Ivana said. Yes, Emil said. The 20th came in 10 days, which was not enough time and had to be. Gathering it took all of them. Ivana spent 2 evenings turning 41 exercise books into a table. Date, notch reading, color word, weather, transcribed exactly, with photographs of every page from May through July, so that no one could say the transcription had improved anything. She wrote a 2-page cover statement in the flat, careful register she'd learned reading regulations, describing the willow stick, the notches, the fact that it was a private measure of relative height and not an instrument, and stating plainly what the log could and could not show. That last part was Emil's insistence, and he had to fight her for it. "You're weakening it," she said. "I'm making it true. If I claim it's a measurement, somebody who knows better tears it up in one sentence, and everything under it goes too." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a strange thing for you to say. I've had a bad year." Vasco compiled the jars, 41 samples between the 9th of November and the 18th of December, twice weekly, 3 points each, taped, dated, double-initialed, photographed against a driven stake, stored in his cellar at a steady temperature with a log of who had opened the door. Most of them were clean water. He put the clean ones first in the folder. 60 good days, he said. That's the evidence. Radka did the thing Emil had never once asked anyone to do, which was to make a phone call on his behalf. She rang a food technology lecturer she'd catered a conference for, who agreed to read the method statement and say whether the sampling protocol was coherent. He replied in 4 days with 11 corrections, all of them about labeling and storage, and Vasco implemented 9 and explained why 2 were impossible in a domestic cellar, and wrote that down too. Nikolova received the package on the 19th. She called on the 20th. "The log alone wouldn't survive an hour," she said. "With the sampling series and a stated methodology and a second observer, it becomes a record of ongoing monitoring by an affected party, and the log becomes context rather than evidence." A pause. "You understand this is public. Aurora will have all of it, with your name on every page." "Yes. They employ 31 people from your village. 31 people from my village will still be employed on the 1st of January, whatever happens on the 28th, Emil said. The pipe doesn't employ anybody. Meanwhile, the farm had to keep running, and this was the part that proved whether anything had changed. House 4's West End came down on the 16th. The insurance assessor came on the 22nd and confirmed a settlement of 3,100 leva after excess, payable in February. Emil did not have 3,100 leva in December, so he did the thing that cost him most. He told people. He told Ivana the loan number out loud, 10,600, repayments of 240 a month, a bank that would restructure if asked. She asked. The bank gave him a 3-month interest-only period on the strength of the insurance letter, which he could have had in October if he'd asked in October. He told Vasco about the wire, All of it, the extension cord and the October and the meaning to replace it, and Vasco said one short, unkind thing and then brought his nephew, who was a qualified electrician, who rewired both remaining houses at cost of materials plus 200 leva, because Vasco asked him to, and because Emil, standing in the yard, said out loud, "I should have called you in October," which the nephew appreciated more than the money. And he told Radka everything about the silt bucket. On the phone, unprompted, on the 23rd of December, the 2 buckets, the dusting of 6 boxes, the 19 magnificent eggs, the burial, that he had never sold one, that he had kept the second bucket on the shelf for 3 weeks, telling himself it was for testing. There was a silence long enough that he thought the line had dropped. "Why are you telling me this?" Radka said. "I'd never have known." "Because you'd have been holding it." "Yes, I would." "And because I want you to buy eggs from me in February, and I'd rather you decide now with everything on the table than in April with half of it." Radka Doncheva was quiet again. Then she said, "Bring me the onion skins problem, properly, numbers." He brought them on the 28th of December, 11 kilos of dry skins a week, needed for 80 boxes, at current market 12 kilos of culled onions to get one of skin, cost per week including labor and fuel, and the 2 failed alternatives with reasons. Radka read it, made 3 phone calls in front of him, and produced a standing arrangement, her own kitchen skins plus 2 other cafes in the district town, plus a pickling operation in Slivnitsa that generated 40 kilos of skin a week as pure waste, and was glad to be rid of it for the cost of a collection. "That's 4 times what you need." "Then I've got a surplus," Emil said, "and next year somebody else can use it." "Somebody else?" "I'm writing the method down." She raised an eyebrow. "You're giving away your only advantage." "My advantage is 1,100 hens and 41 years. Anybody can boil an onion." The appeal hearing was on the 28th of December in the district administrative office, and Emil went in a suit that had last been worn at his wife's funeral. It did not go the way he expected, because nothing legal ever does. Aurora did not attack the log. Petrova barely mentioned it. She attacked the sampling, the domestic cellar, the glass jars from a bakery, the absence of accredited analysis on anything Vasco had collected, and she was right about most of it, and Vasco had already written down that she was right about most of it, and Nikolova put that document in front of the panel herself. Then Slavov spoke, and the complication arrived, and it was entirely believable and impossible to argue with. Aurora had, in November, commissioned an upgrade to the stilling basin, a larger settlement volume, and a rebuilt weir. Work was scheduled for March. Slavov produced the contract. Aurora's position was that the May overflow had been a one-off caused by an undersized basin, that the undersizing was acknowledged, that it was already being fixed at company expense, and that a formal finding against them served no purpose except to damage a rural employer. It was reasonable, it was probably even sincere, and it would have worked, because the panel visibly wanted it to work, and because the alternative was a finding based on one day's sample supported by a farmer's notched stick. Nikolova looked at Emil. And Emil understood, sitting in a plastic chair in his funeral suit, exactly what he had brought into the room and what it was for. He had brought 60 clean days. He asked to speak. He was 74 and not a public man, and his voice came out too quiet at first. "The upgrade is for volume," he said. "A bigger basin holds more water before it spills. That fixes an overflow." "Yes," Slavov said. "My records don't show one overflow." Emil opened the transcription to the pages Ivana had marked. "They show the ditch running orange on the 14th of May, and then on 19 days between May and the 9th of July. Some of those days it hadn't rained. I wrote the weather every morning for 41 years, including on days nothing happened, which is why you can check it. A pause in the room. On the 4th of June, it hadn't rained for 11 days, and the ditch ran orange to the 5th notch. A basin doesn't overflow in a drought. He set the book down. So either it's spilling when it shouldn't, or something's coming down that line that isn't only rain, and a bigger basin doesn't fix either one. It just makes it happen less often where anybody can see it. Slavov said, "That's speculation." "It is," Emil said. "That's why I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking them to sample it in a drought." Nikolova was already writing. The panel did not find against Aurora that day. What it did was worse for Aurora and better than Emil had hoped. It adjourned the appeal and directed the inspectorate to conduct a monitoring program through the following spring and summer, including dry weather sampling at the outfall, at Aurora's cost, with the March upgrade to proceed regardless. The existing notice was held in suspension pending the results. Vasco, in the corridor, laughed until he had to sit down on a radiator. "Dry weather," he said. 30 years I've been telling people. You catch nobody in a storm. Everybody's clean in a storm." The costs did not vanish. In January, Emil paid interest only and ate into the insurance before it arrived. In February, the 3,100 came and went into timber, nest boxes, and the electrician's materials. He rebuilt House 4's west end with Ivana and Vasco and 2 neighbors over 9 weekends, and it was not finished until the 2nd week of March. And 40 new nest boxes were made from spruce boards because he could not afford the oak his father had used and because a nest box does not care. Lay came back with the light. By the middle of March, he was at 810 again, on 980 birds, having not replaced the 38 and having culled the worst of the molters. Radka took 160 dozen a week from the 1st of March at 42 stotinki, not 200. She had been clear about that. She'd rather have a supply she could describe than a supply that was bigger. The delicatessen did not come back. A different one, in the same city, did, in April, having heard about the hearing from the lecturer Radka had called. The method statement, 4 pages with photographs, quantities per box, drying times, the 2 failures and why they failed, the sieve mesh, the collection timing, and a plain warning that the process only marked eggs whose cuticle was still soft and that a washed egg would not take it, Emil finished in February. Ivana printed 40 copies at the shop. He gave them to anyone who asked, and by June, 3 other small producers were doing it, including one Emil had never met, and one of them improved the drying stage by using a polytunnel and sent him a note about it. Panev came in April, in the yard, unwilling to come inside for about 90 seconds. "The school kitchen's asking," he said. "They can have 400 a week at 30. That's over." "It's what they cost." Panev worked his jaw. 32 and I'll take 600. 32 and you take them unwashed with the label on. With that whole paragraph? With the whole paragraph. Panev looked at the ridge for a while. "You're going to be insufferable about this for 10 years, he said, and took out his order book. On the 14th of May, a year to the day, Emil Radev walked his ditch line at 5 in the morning. He carried a flashlight and the willow stick, and also a glass jar with a tape label already dated, and a small camera Ivana had bought him and taught him to use 4 times. The stick went in beside the culvert. It came out wet to the 2nd notch, clean. He filled the jar anyway, wrote the time and the weather, and photographed the stake. 60 good days, then 100, then more. The inspectorate's dry weather sampling was scheduled for July. He would have his own to sit beside it. Ivana came down the causeway with 2 mugs, her hair flat on one side. Behind her, along the raised path, hens were coming out of House 4 into the gray light and turning east, away from the water, the way they had learned to. "Vasco's coming at 8, she said, "and that woman from Pernick about the method sheet. Then I'll want the shed swept." "I already swept it." She handed him the coffee and looked at the stick in his hand. "What's it say?" 41 years. He had answered that question with a grunt. "Second notch," Emil said. "Clean. 11 days no rain." He handed her the jar. "Write it down.